I was finishing my shift at the pizza place on a chilly October night, the air thick with the scent of rain. The rain had started earlier, turning the streets into shimmering paths under the streetlights. My last order was for 4 large pizzas, delivered to a house on the outskirts of town, an address I hadn't seen before. The thought of navigating the winding, empty roads gave me an uneasy feeling, but the promise of a hefty tip kept me going. I loaded the pizzas into my car, the heater struggling against the cold as I drove. The road took me through a dense forest, the trees looming like silent guardians in the darkness. My headlights barely pierced the thick canopy, casting long, eerie shadows on the gravel road. My phone buzzed with a message from the pizza app, confirming the address one more time. I double-checked, took a deep breath, and pressed on. The house appeared suddenly, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was an old Victorian-style home, its windows dark and uninviting, the paint peeling in long strips. No lights were on, and there were no signs of life. I parked the car, my hands trembling slightly as I grabbed the pizzas. My mind raced with thoughts of how unusual this delivery was, but I reminded myself it was just a job. I approached the front door, the wood creaking under my weight as I knocked. Silence greeted me, thick and oppressive. I knocked again, louder this time, calling out, "Pizza delivery." Still nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine, the night air growing colder as if the house itself exhaled a breath of darkness. Summoning my courage, I knocked a 3rd time, and then I heard it, a faint rustling from inside. My heart pounded as I reached for the doorbell, but there wasn't one. Instead, there was a window beside the door slightly ajar. I leaned closer, peering inside. But all I could see was darkness. The rustling grew louder, more insistent, as if something was moving just out of sight. I backed away, the sense of being watched overwhelming me. Suddenly, a figure appeared at one of the windows, staring directly at me. Its eyes were unnaturally wide, reflecting the din in a way that made my blood run cold. I dropped the pizzas, heart racing, and ran back to my car. As I fumbled with the keys, trying desperately to start the engine, the rain began to pour harder, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. The car wouldn't turn over, the engine making a desperate, dying sound before falling silent. Panic surged through me as I realized I was stranded, miles away from any help. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The operator answered, and I stammered out my location, explaining the eerie house and the figure at the window. She assured me help was on the way, but with the storm raging, it might be a while. I slid back into the seat, trying to stay calm, but the feeling of being hunted was unbearable. Minutes felt like hours as I sat in the cold car, listening to the howling wind and the distant sounds of the forest. Suddenly, the car door creaked open, and a shadowy figure slipped inside. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the same eyes staring back at me from the darkness. The figure didn't move, just stood there, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I fumbled for the door lock, desperately trying to secure myself, but the figure reached out a hand, and the car filled with an icy chill. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from the pizza place manager, but before I could read it, the figure began to speak. Its voice a low whisper that seemed to echo from the walls of the car itself. "You shouldn't have delivered these pizzas here," it said, the words sending shivers down my spine. I didn't know what it meant, but fear took over, and I kicked the door open, scrambling out into the storm. Rain drenched me instantly as I ran through the forest, branches snapping under my feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, collapsing by the roadside as the sirens finally pierced the night. The police arrived, investigating the house but finding nothing unusual, just the abandoned building and traces of a recent disturbance. They couldn't explain the figure or why my car was sabotaged, leaving me with more questions than answers. To this day, I avoid that remote house whenever I can. Sometimes, when the night is quiet and the forest seems too still, I swear I can hear the faint whisper of that voice, reminding me of the night when a simple pizza delivery turned into a nightmare I can't escape. I was working the late shift at Tony's Pizza, the kind of place that stayed open until midnight on weekends. It was a typical busy night, orders coming in thick and fast. I handed a stack of steaming pizzas to a customer with a smile, feeling the warmth of the oven still lingering on my hands. The address was familiar. 103 Oak Street, right in my neighborhood. It wasn't too far from home, just a short drive through the quiet streets. As I navigated the familiar route, the streets were unusually empty for that hour. The streetlights cast long shadows, and an eerie silence enveloped the area. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the late hour making everything seem more sinister. My mind wandered to thoughts of finally being home after a long night, looking forward to relaxing with a slice of my own pizza. When I pulled up to the house, it stood alone at the end of the Col de Sac. The house was old, with peeling paint and overgrown bushes that seemed to whisper in the wind. There were no lights on, and not a single car was parked in the driveway. I took a deep breath, grabbed the pizzas, and walked up to the front door. It creaked loudly as I knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. Nothing happened. I knocked again, a bit harder this time, but still no response. Unease settled in my stomach. I glanced around, noticing how the house seemed darker than usual, the windows like black eyes watching me. I pulled out my phone to call the customer, but there was no signal. A chill ran down my spine. I felt like I was being watched. Deciding to leave the pizzas on the porch, I turned to walk back to my car. As I reached the driveway, I heard a faint tapping sound behind me. I froze, turning slowly to see a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the yard. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make out any details. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silent and still. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing loudly as I hurried back to my car. As I fumbled with the keys, the tap-in turned into soft footsteps, matching my every move. Panic surged through me as I finally got the door open and slammed it shut. I locked all the doors and jumped into the driver's seat, heart racing. I tried to start the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again, desperation growing, but still nothing. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the same figure now standing directly behind my car, just across the street. Their face was obscured by shadows, but their presence was undeniable. I ducked down, hiding my face, and tried to call for help, but my phone was dead. The darkness outside seemed to press in, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, the headlights of another car appeared in my rearview mirror, approaching slowly. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived when the car stopped abruptly, and the figure stepped into the light. It was a woman, her eyes hollow and empty, a faint smile twisting her lips. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. She raised her hand, pointing directly at me, her smile growing wider. In a burst of adrenaline, I yanked open the door and bolted out of the car, sprinting down the driveway and into the darkness of the street. My breaths came out in ragged gasps as I ran, heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, I heard footsteps matching mine, the sound never slowing. I darted down alleyways and side streets, trying to lose her, but no matter where I turned, her presence was always just behind me. Finally, I reached my house, panting and terrified. I fumbled with my keys, the door finally giving way as I threw myself inside. I slammed it shut and leaned against it, trying to steady my shaking body, but the terror didn't subside. I kept hearing whispers, soft and menacing, filling the rooms of my house. I knew she was still out there, watching, waiting. I grabbed my phone and managed to send a text to my friend, explaining everything, hoping for assistance. The minutes felt like hours as I waited, every sound amplified in the silence of my home. Then, a loud crash came from the kitchen, followed by the unmistakable sound of the front door being forced open. I froze, fear rooting me to the spot. Gathering what little courage I had left, I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy cast iron skillet, and stood ready to defend myself. The door slowly creaked open, and there she stood, the same woman, her eyes now filled with sorrow instead of malice. She extended a hand toward me, her expression pleading. I hesitated, confusion mixing with fear. In that moment, the room seemed to twist and distort, the air thick with unspoken pain. I realized she wasn't there to harm me, but to share a tragic story of loneliness and loss. As her form began to fade, the oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of sorrow. I stood there, heart still racing, unsure of what just happened. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but the woman never returned. I quit my job at the pizza place shortly after, unable to face those eerie nights again. Sometimes when the streets are silent and the shadows grow long, I think I can still hear her whispers, a haunting reminder of that terrifying night. remember it was a Friday night, and I was craving pizza after a long week. I ordered from a local place expecting the usual quick delivery. The address was mine, but something felt off that night. Maybe it was the eerie silence outside or the way the clouds concealed the moon. I shrugged it off and waited. About 30 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. I went to answer it, the smell of warm cheese and pepperoni filling my senses. Standing there was a delivery driver, his uniform slightly disheveled, his face pale under the streetlight. He handed me the boxes without a word, his eyes darting nervously around. I thanked him, but he lingered for a moment before turning and walking away into the darkness. I closed the door and began to unpack the pizzas, but something made me pause. One of the boxes was different. It was wrapped in black foil with strange symbols etched into it. Curious, I decided to open it first. As the lid lifted, a cold draft escaped, and the room seemed to grow darker. Inside was a pizza topped with ingredients I didn't recognize: dark mushrooms, a crimson sauce, and slices of something that looked like thin, shadowy tendrils. I took a bite, dismissing the oddity as a special recipe. The taste was unlike anything I'd ever had, rich and haunting, with a lingering bitterness that clawed at my throat. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the air grew thick with tension. I heard whispers, faint at first, then growing louder, echoing around the room. I turned to look behind me, but nothing was there. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, stretching and twisting like living things. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from the pizza place. "Enjoy your meal." My heart raced. I tried to call my friend to share the strange experience, but there was no signal. Every time I tried, the call would drop, leaving me in oppressive silence. A chill ran down my spine as the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath became visible, forming small clouds in the air. The whispers turned into voices, soft and pleading, filling my mind with unsettling images. I felt eyes watching me from every shadow, every corner of my house. Panic set in as I realized I wasn't alone. I grabbed the remaining pizza boxes, wanting to leave the house, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force held it shut. Desperate, I ran to the windows, but they were covered in frost, making it impossible to see outside. The voices grew louder, more insistent, telling me to stay, to listen. I backed away, feeling the weight of unseen eyes pressing in on me. In the midst of my terror, the realization hit me. The special pizza was more than just a meal. It was a beacon, a summons for something dark and malevolent to enter my home. I remembered an old urban legend about cursed food deliveries, acts of revenge from wronged spirits. Maybe this was one of them. Determined to survive, I searched for anything that could break the spell. My eyes landed on a picture frame on the shelf. It was a family photo, taken years ago, when everything was normal. Holding it tightly, I recited a prayer I vaguely remembered from childhood, pleading for protection. The voices began to wane, the shadows receding as light slowly returned to the room. The door unlocked with a faint click, and the oppressive weight lifted. I didn't wait to see what else might come. I grabbed the cursed pizza and threw it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it, hoping to erase the nightmare. The room warmed up, the darkness vanished, and the house felt safe once more. The next day I called the pizza place, but there was no one to answer. No one ever did deliveries to my house that night. I moved out shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me. To this day, I avoid ordering pizza alone, always wary of the night and the shadows that linger just beyond the light. If you've ever had a delivery that felt too strange, maybe be careful what you wish for. Sometimes, a simple meal can bring more than just hunger. It can awaken fears best left untouched.